She heard his agonized cry echoing across the Colorado Canyon and knew that saving the trapped Comanche warrior would either forge an unbreakable bond or cost her everything she held dear. Defies. The autumn wind carried death across the high desert of Colorado Territory in 1878, whistling through red sandstone canyons like the wails of lost spirits. Hannah Morrison pressed her weathered hands against the rough wooden windowsill of her remote cabin, watching storm clouds gather over the distant peaks. At 28, she had learned to read the signs that others missed. The way eagles circled before a blizzard, how her mare Copper's ears twitched at the approach of strangers, and most importantly, how silence in these mountains always preceded danger. The scream that shattered the morning's stillness was unlike anything in nature's chorus. Raw, primal, and distinctly human, it echoed off canyon walls like a wounded animal's final plea. Hannah's blood chilled as the sound repeated, weaker now but no less desperate. She grabbed her leather medical satchel, a relic from her late father's practice in St. Louis, and checked its contents with practiced efficiency. Laudanum for pain, clean bandages torn from old petticoats, a bone saw she prayed she'd never need to use, and the small silver flask of whiskey that served as both antiseptic and courage when facing the impossible. Copper snorted nervously as Hannah saddled her, the mare's nostrils flaring at scents carried on the wind. The cry came again, weaker still, and Hannah knew that every moment of hesitation meant the difference between life and death. She had chosen this isolated life precisely to escape such moments of reckoning, fleeing west after losing her fiancé Thomas to a Cheyenne raid near Fort Collins. The irony wasn't lost on her that she might now be riding toward the very people she'd spent 3 years avoiding. The terrain grew treacherous as Hannah followed the sound deeper into Devil's Canyon, a maze of red rock formations that had swallowed countless travelers whole. Local settlers whispered that the canyon was cursed, that strange lights danced there on moonless nights, and that those who ventured too deep were never seen again. Hannah had always dismissed such talk as frontier superstition, but now, with each echo of that tormented voice, she wondered if the canyon truly did hunger for souls. 20 minutes of hard riding brought her to a narrow ledge overlooking a steep ravine. Below, partially hidden by scrub oak and mountain mahogany, something moved. Hannah dismounted and crept to the edge, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. What she saw below made her stomach lurch with a mixture of horror and recognition. A massive figure knelt in a twisted position beside a boulder, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. Even from 50 feet above, she could see the cruel steel jaws of a bear trap clamped around his ankle, its serrated teeth buried deep in flesh and bone. The man was clearly Comanche, his long black hair braided with eagle feathers, his bronzed skin marked with the ritual scars of a warrior, his powerful frame clothed in buckskin leggings and a beaded vest that spoke of high rank within his tribe. Blood had pooled beneath the trap, staining the red earth an even deeper crimson. His breathing came in ragged gasps, and even from her distant perch, Hannah could see the pallor creeping across his features as life slowly ebbed away. Every instinct screamed at her to flee. The Comanche were the most feared warriors on the frontier, masters of guerrilla warfare who had terrorized white settlements for generations. Thomas had died at the hands of their Cheyenne allies, and she had sworn never again to show mercy to any who rode with war paint. Yet as she watched the warrior struggle against the trap's merciless grip, she saw not a savage enemy, but a human being facing a death more cruel than any creature deserved. The climb down to the ravine floor required all of Hannah's frontier skills. She used her rope to rappel from ledge to ledge, her boots scrabbling for purchase on loose shale that threatened to send her tumbling into the depths below. Twice she nearly lost her footing, saved only by her desperate grip on the rope and years of navigating Colorado's unforgiving terrain. As she descended, the warrior's labored breathing grew louder, punctuated by occasional groans that spoke of pain beyond human endurance. When Hannah finally reached the bottom of the ravine, she found herself facing a sight that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The bear trap was a massive thing, designed to hold a full-grown grizzly, its steel jaws easily 10 inches across. The Comanche's ankle had been caught at the worst possible angle, with the trap's teeth penetrating to the bone on both sides. Dark blood seeped steadily from the wound, forming a spreading pool that attracted buzzing flies despite the cool mountain air. The warrior's dark eyes fixed on her as she approached, and Hannah saw something unexpected in their depths, not hatred or defiance, but a weary resignation tinged with curiosity. Here was a man who had accepted his fate, yet wondered what strange twist of circumstance had brought a white woman to witness his final moments. His lips moved slightly, and Hannah caught what sounded like a Comanche death chant. Low and melodic despite his obvious agony, Hannah knelt beside him, careful to stay clear of his powerful arms while she examined the trap. The mechanism was spring-loaded, designed to clamp shut with bone-crushing force when triggered. Opening it would require tremendous strength applied at precisely the right angle, and even then, the sudden release might cause additional damage to the already mangled limb. Worse yet, the warrior had clearly been trapped for hours, long enough for infection to set in, and for massive blood loss to weaken his system beyond recovery. The Comanche watched her examination with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When she gestured toward the trap and mimed the motion of opening it, he nodded slightly and spoke a single word in his native tongue. Hannah didn't understand the language, but the meaning was clear enough. He was giving her permission to try, even though they both knew the attempt might kill him faster than leaving the trap alone. It was a gesture of trust so profound that it took her breath away. Hannah opened her medical bag and retrieved the laudanum, holding the small brown bottle where the warrior could see it. Again she mimed, this time showing him drinking from the bottle, and again he nodded his consent. She helped him lift his head and poured a generous dose between his lips, watching as his throat worked to swallow the bitter medicine. Within minutes, some of the tension left his features as the opium began to dull the worst of his pain. While waiting for the laudanum to take full effect, Hannah studied the trap more carefully. It was clearly handmade, forged by someone who understood both metallurgy and the anatomy of large predators. The spring mechanism showed signs of recent use, suggesting that whoever had set it was still active in the area. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the implications. This was no random accident, but part of a systematic campaign to clear the canyon of both wildlife and human intruders. The warrior's breathing had grown steadier under the laudanum's influence, though his color remained dangerously pale. Hannah knew she had perhaps an hour before shock and blood loss would claim him, trap or no trap. She positioned herself at the trap's base and gripped the release mechanism with both hands, her muscles straining against the powerful spring. The metal was slick with blood, making her grip treacherous, and her first attempt accomplished nothing but a slight loosening of the jaws would come. Sweat beaded on Hannah's forehead despite the cool mountain air as she repositioned herself for another attempt. The warrior watched her efforts with eyes that had grown glassy from the laudanum, but she could still see appreciation in their depths. Here was a man accustomed to solving problems through strength and skill, forced to place his life entirely in the hands of a stranger, and not just any stranger, but a member of the very people his tribe had warred against for generations. Her second attempt produced a grinding noise from the trap's mechanism, and Hannah felt the jaws give slightly. Encouraged, she braced her feet against the boulder and threw all her weight into the effort. The trap's spring fought back with mechanical fury, but gradually, inch by painful inch, the steel jaws began to part. The warrior's ankle, freed from the crushing pressure, began to bleed more freely as circulation returned to the damaged tissue. The moment the trap's jaws opened wide enough, Hannah grabbed the warrior's leg and pulled it clear of the mechanism. The trap snapped shut again with a sound like breaking bones, its steel teeth clicking together where human flesh had been moments before. The warrior gasped and nearly lost consciousness from the sudden change in circulation, his head falling back against the boulder as his body tried to process the trauma of release. Hannah immediately went to work on the wound, cleaning it as best she could with water from her canteen and examining the extent of the damage. The trap's teeth had missed the major arteries by mere fractions of an inch, though the ankle bone itself showed obvious fractures. She packed the wounds with clean bandages and bound the entire foot tightly to control the bleeding, working with the focused efficiency her father had drilled into her during their years together in his medical practice. As she worked, Hannah became aware that the warrior was studying her face with growing intensity. When their eyes met, he spoke again in Comanche, his voice stronger now that the worst pain had passed. Though she couldn't understand his words, his tone conveyed something between gratitude and puzzlement, as if he were trying to reconcile her actions with everything he had been taught about white settlerism. The sun had moved noticeably across the sky by the time Hannah finished her initial treatment of the wounds. The warrior's color had improved slightly, though he was still far too pale for her liking. She offered him water from her canteen, supporting his head while he drank deeply. When he had finished, he reached into a small pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made Hannah's breath catch in her throat. It was a carved bone pendant, intricate in its design and clearly of great personal value. The warrior pressed it into Hannah's palm and spoke again in Comanche, his eyes never leaving her face. She didn't need translation to understand that he was offering her something precious, a token of gratitude that transcended the barriers of language and culture. The bone was warm from his body heat and smooth from years of handling. Hannah started to refuse the gift, but something in the warrior's expression stopped her. This was not charity or payment for services rendered, but recognition of a debt that could never truly be repaid. She closed her fingers around the pendant and nodded her acceptance, seeing relief flicker across his features. In that moment, some invisible barrier between them crumbled, replaced by a connection neither had expected to find. The reality of their situation crashed back as Hannah realized they were still trapped in the bottom of a ravine with storm clouds gathering overhead. The warrior was in no condition to climb, and she lacked the strength to carry him up the treacherous path she had descended. Worse yet, the sound of her gunshot echoing off canyon walls might have attracted unwanted attention from either hostile Indians or the person who had set the trap in the first place. As if summoned by her thoughts, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed from somewhere above them. Hannah's blood ran cold as she counted at least 4 horses approaching at a steady pace. The warrior heard them too and struggled to sit up straighter, his hand instinctively reaching for a knife that was no longer at his belt. It had been lost somewhere during his struggle with the trap. Hannah quickly inventoried their options and found them dismally limited. They could hide among the boulders and hope the riders passed by without investigating, but the blood trail and signs of struggle would be obvious to anyone with tracking skills. They could try to climb out of the ravine, but the warrior's condition made that impossible, and abandoning him was unthinkable after all she had done to save his life. The hoofbeats grew closer and Hannah made her decision. She helped the warrior move behind the largest boulder, positioning him so that he could see the approach but remain hidden from casual observation. Then she climbed partway up the ravine wall to a position where she could observe the rim, while still being able to retreat quickly if necessary. Her father's old Colt revolver felt reassuringly heavy in her hand. 3 men appeared at the ravine's edge, their faces hard and weathered from years of frontier living. Hannah recognized the type immediately. Bounty hunters, Indian fighters, the kind of men who made their living from violence and cared little about the methods they employed. The leader, a bearded man with cruel eyes, gestured toward the blood trail that led down into the ravine. "Someone sprung our trap," he called to his companions, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air, "and from the looks of it, they freed whatever we caught." The second man, younger but no less vicious-looking, spat into the dust. "Could be that Comanche war party we've been tracking. They're clever enough to help their own." The third rider, a thin man with the pale complexion of someone more accustomed to saloons than saddles, shifted nervously in his seat. Hannah's heart pounded as the implications became clear. These men were professional Indian hunters, probably working for the territorial government's bounty program that paid gold for Native American scalps. The trap had been set specifically to catch and cripple any Comanche brave unfortunate enough to trigger it, turning what should have been a quick death into prolonged agony. The leader was already dismounting, rifle in hand, clearly intending to investigate the ravine floor. Hannah knew that discovery was inevitable. The blood trail was too obvious, and men like these had tracking skills honed by years of hunting human prey. In moments, they would find both her and the wounded warrior, and she had no illusions about their intentions toward either. The bounty hunter's boots scraped against loose shale as he began his descent into the ravine, each step deliberate and measured, like a predator stalking wounded prey. Hannah pressed herself against the canyon wall, her heart thundering so loudly she was certain it would give away their position. Below her, Tachi had gone completely still, every muscle tense despite his injuries, transforming from wounded man into something far more dangerous, a Comanche warrior preparing for what might be his final battle. "Blood still wet," the leader called up to his companions, his gravelly voice echoing off the stone walls. "Whatever we caught ain't been gone long." He paused to examine the trap, now reset and waiting for its next victim, its steel jaws gleaming with fresh crimson. Somebody knew what they were doing, though. Takes skill to spring one of these without losing fingers. His weathered face twisted into something that might have been admiration or annoyance. Hannah caught a glimpse of movement from Tachi's hiding place and realized with growing alarm that the warrior was attempting to stand. The laudanum had dulled his pain enough to make him dangerously overconfident in his abilities, and his warrior's pride was overriding basic survival instinct. She had to act quickly before his movement betrayed them both to the killers above. Moving with the silent grace learned from 3 years of solitary mountain living, Hannah worked her way down to Tachi's position behind the boulder. The Comanche's dark eyes met hers, and she saw the internal struggle playing out across his features, between the tactical wisdom of remaining hidden and the deep-seated need to face his enemies standing upright like the warrior he was. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder and shook her head slightly, hoping he would understand her meaning. The bounty hunter continued his methodical examination of the ravine floor, following the blood trail with the persistence of a bloodhound. His boots crunched on loose gravel with each step, and Hannah could hear him muttering to himself as he worked. Smart Indian, I'll give him that. Took time to clean and bandage the wound before moving on. Most of them would have just run bleeding until they dropped. There was professional respect in his voice, the grudging acknowledgement of one predator for another's skills. From above, the younger hunter called down impatiently, "How long are we going to spend on this, Garrett? That war party could be miles away by now, and we're burning daylight chasing ghosts." His voice carried the petulant tone of someone accustomed to easy prey, uncomfortable with the patient tracking required for truly dangerous quarry. The sound of creaking leather suggested he was shifting restlessly in his saddle. Garrett, apparently the leader, spat contemptuously at his companion's impatience. "You want to explain to Colonel Morrison why we let a wounded Comanche slip through our fingers? That brave's worth $50 in gold, dead or alive. And wounded means we can take our time with the questioning before we collect." The casual cruelty in his voice made Hannah's stomach turn, but it also triggered a memory that sent ice through her veins. Colonel Morrison, the territorial commander who had put the bounty on Indian scalps, was her late husband's brother, Thomas Morrison, a man she had carefully avoided since fleeing west after Thomas's death. If these hunters worked directly for him, they would recognize her name instantly, and her presence here protecting a wounded Comanche would be seen as the ultimate betrayal of her dead husband's memory. The third hunter, the pale man she had noticed earlier, finally spoke up with a voice that carried the educated accent of someone who had seen better days. "Perhaps we should consider that whoever freed the brave might still be in the area. The tracks suggest a single horse, possibly a woman's mount based on the lighter. Impression and shorter stride," his observation, was delivered with the detached precision of a man analyzing a chess problem. Rather than hunting human beings, Hannah's blood chilled as she realized how much these men had already deduced from the evidence scattered around the canyon floor. Her own tracks would be impossible to hide completely, and eventually their methodical search would uncover both her and Tachi's hiding place. She needed to create a distraction, something to draw them away from Theravine long enough for her to figure out how to get the wounded warrior to safety. Yet, Tachi seemed to sense her internal struggle, and when she looked at him, he was already reaching for something in his medicine pouch. What he withdrew made her breath catch in her throat, a small clay pot sealed with beeswax, the kind used to store the war paint that could transform a Comanche brave into the stuff of frontier nightmares. His intentions were clear enough. If discovery was inevitable, he intended to meet his enemies as a warrior, not as a helpless victim. The sound of Garrett's investigation was growing closer, his methodical search bringing him inexorably toward their hiding place. Hannah could hear him examining broken branches and disturbed earth, reading the story of the trap's activation and Tachi's subsequent rescue with the skill of a master tracker. It would be only minutes before he rounded the boulder that concealed them. Desperation breeds creativity, and Hannah found herself remembering a trick her father had taught her during their journey west, how to create a medical diversion that would send men running in the opposite direction. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small vial of carbolic acid, normally used for sterilizing wounds, but potent enough in its pure form to create convincing symptoms of disease when applied to cloth and scattered strategically. Working quickly and silently, Hannah soaked several strips of bandage in the acid solution and scattered them among the rocks upwind from Garrett's position. Within moments, the sharp medicinal stench would reach his nostrils and create the impression that whoever had been here was suffering from some form of contagious illness, hopefully enough to make professional killers think twice about close pursuit. The ruse worked better than she had dared hope. Garrett's investigation came to an abrupt halt when the chemical smell reached him, followed by a stream of profanity that would have made a saloon keeper blush. "Son of a bitch," he called up to his companions. "Whoever was here had the fever, maybe cholera by the smell of it. We need to get out of this canyon before we catch whatever they had." The fear in his voice was genuine. Even hardened killers knew better than to risk disease for the sake of $50 in bounty money. The retreat began immediately, with all three hunters scrambling to put distance between themselves and what they perceived as a contaminated area. Hannah listened to their hurried departure with a mixture of relief and growing concern. She had bought them time, but at the cost of making the entire canyon appear disease-ridden. Any other travelers who caught wind of the deception would avoid the area completely, leaving her and Tachi truly isolated. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Hannah turned her attention back to the wounded warrior. The laudanum was beginning to wear off, and pain was once again etching lines across his weathered features. More concerning was the fevered flush that had begun to color his cheeks, a sign that infection was setting in despite her careful cleaning. Of the wound, Tachi spoke softly in Comanche, his voice barely above a whisper, and gestured toward the vial of carbolic acid still clutched in Hannah's hand. Though she couldn't understand his words, his meaning was clear enough. He had observed her ruse and approved of her tactical thinking. There was respect in his dark eyes, the acknowledgement of one survivor recognizing another's resourcefulness. Under pressure, the immediate danger had passed, but their situation remained precarious. Tachi needed proper medical attention that Hannah couldn't provide with her limited supplies, and the approaching storm clouds promised to turn the ravine into a death trap if they didn't find shelter soon. She had to get him out of the canyon, but his injuries made travel extremely dangerous. Hannah began gathering her scattered medical supplies, her mind racing through possible solutions to their predicament. Her cabin was only 3 miles away, But the terrain between here and there included 2 river crossings and a steep mountain pass that would challenge even a healthy man. Tachi watched her preparations with intelligent eyes, clearly trying to assess his own capabilities against the demands of the journey ahead. The warrior made his first attempt to stand, using the boulder for support, and immediately went white around the eyes as pain shot through his damaged ankle. Hannah was beside him instantly, her arm around his waist to prevent a fall that could undo all her careful bandaging work. His skin was burning hot against her touch, confirming her fears about developing infection. When Tachi's vision cleared, he looked down at Hannah with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Here was a man accustomed to relying on his own strength and skill, now forced to depend on the kindness of someone his people had been taught to consider an enemy. The vulnerability in his eyes was almost harder to witness than his physical. Pain had been. Hannah helped him settle back against the boulder and began fashioning a makeshift crutch from a sturdy branch she found among the debris scattered around the canyon floor. Her father had taught her the basic principles of wilderness medicine, including how to create mobility aids from available materials. The branch was straight and strong, worn smooth by years of wind and weather. While she worked, Tachi reached into another pouch at his belt and withdrew what appeared to be a collection of dried herbs wrapped in soft leather. He selected several leaves and began chewing them methodically, his expression suggesting they were intensely bitter. Hannah recognized the behavior from her father's medical books. Many Indian tribes possessed sophisticated knowledge of natural pain management and infection prevention. The herb mixture seemed to help, bringing some color back to Tachi's features and steadying his breathing. He offered some of the remaining leaves to Hannah, gesturing toward a small cut on her hand that she hadn't even noticed receiving during their ordeal. The gesture was simple but profound, a wounded man sharing his medicine with the person who had saved his life. Hannah accepted the herbs gratefully and applied them to her cut as she had seen him do. The effect was almost immediate. A cooling sensation, followed by numbness that suggested the plants contained natural analgesic properties. She made mental note to ask him about the herbs if they both survived long enough for proper conversation. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally arrived, with the sudden violence typical of mountain weather. Rain began falling in heavy drops that quickly became a steady downpour, turning the ravine floor into a maze of rivulets and pools. Hannah realized with growing alarm that they needed to reach higher ground immediately or risk being trapped. By flash flooding, getting Tachi mobile became a matter of urgent necessity rather than gradual preparation. Hannah helped him to his feet again, this time supporting most of his weight while he tested the makeshift crutch. His jaw was clenched with determination, but sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort required just to remain upright. Climb out of the ravine proved to be an ordeal that tested both their limits. Hannah had to scout ahead for each handhold and foothold, then return to help guide Tachi up sections that would have been challenging even for an uninjured man. Several times they were forced to stop while he caught his breath and fought off. Waves of dizziness from blood loss and pain. Halfway up the canyon wall, disaster nearly struck when a section of loose shale gave way under Tachi's weight. Only Hannah's quick reflexes and desperate grab for his arm prevented a fall that would have undone all their progress. For a moment, they hung suspended against the rock face, her slight frame the only thing standing between him and a potentially fatal plunge. The physical contact of that near fall created an unexpected moment of connection between them. Hannah found herself looking directly into Tachi's eyes from mere inches away, seeing past the war paint and cultural differences to the essential humanity beneath. He was no longer the fearsome Comanche warrior of frontier legend, but simply a man fighting for survival with courage and dignity intact. They reached the top of the ravine just as the rain intensified into a genuine downpour. Hannah's cabin was still miles away through terrain that would be treacherous even in good weather, and Tachi's condition was deteriorating with each passing hour. She needed to make a decision that could mean the difference between life and death for both of them. Scanning the surrounding landscape through the driving rain, Hannah spotted something that offered a glimmer of hope. The dark mouth of a cave set into the canyon wall about a quarter-mile from their current position. It wasn't ideal shelter, but it would provide protection from the storm while she decided on their next course of action. The journey to the cave took nearly an hour, with frequent stops to rest and assess Tachi's condition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By the time they reached the entrance, both were soaked to the skin and shivering from cold and exhaustion. Hannah helped the warrior settle against the cave wall while she explored their temporary refuge. The cave proved to be larger than she had expected, extending back into the mountain far enough to provide complete shelter from the storm. More importantly, it showed signs of previous human habitation: fire-blackened stones arranged in a rough circle, stores of dry wood, and even a small cache of emergency supplies left by some previous traveler. Hannah quickly built a fire using the stored wood and her father's old tinderbox, filling the cave with welcome warmth and light. The flames revealed more details of their shelter, Indian pictographs on the walls, suggesting this was a sacred site, and evidence that it had been used as a way station by travelers for generations. As warmth began to return to their chilled bodies, Hannah took the opportunity to examine Tachi's wound more thoroughly. The improvised bandages were holding, but she could see signs of swelling and inflammation that concerned her greatly. Without proper antiseptics and surgical instruments, infection was almost inevitable. Tachi seemed to understand her worry, and once again reached for his collection of medicinal herbs. This time he selected different leaves and began preparing what appeared to be a poultice, mixing the crushed plants with water from her canteen to create a paste with a distinctly antiseptic smell. The application of the herbal medicine was clearly painful, causing Tachi to grip the cave wall with white knuckles while Hannah worked. But within minutes of its application, she could see the angry red inflammation beginning to subside. Whatever plants he carried possessed genuine healing properties that rivaled anything in her father's medical bag. As night fell and the storm raged outside their shelter, Hannah and Tachi settled into an uneasy companionship beside the fire. They were safe for the moment, but morning would bring new challenges, getting him to proper medical care, avoiding the bounty hunters who might return, and somehow bridging the vast cultural divide that separated their worlds. Dawn crept into the sacred cave like a cautious animal, its pale light revealing details that the flickering firelight had kept hidden. Hannah stirred from her uneasy sleep against the cave wall to find Tachi already awake, his dark eyes studying the ancient pictographs that covered every surface around them. The paintings told stories and symbols she couldn't read: warriors on horseback, buffalo hunts, and strange spiraling patterns that seemed to dance in the morning light. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming with moisture. Hannah could hear water dripping from the cave entrance and the distant call of eagles riding the morning thermals. More importantly, she could see that Tachi's fever had broken sometime during the night. His skin had lost the dangerous flush of infection, though he remained pale from blood loss. As Hannah moved to check his bandages, Tachi spoke quietly in English, his first words in her language since their ordeal began. "This place knows you," he said, his voice heavily accented but clear. The statement was so unexpected that Hannah nearly dropped her medical supplies. She followed his gaze to a section of wall she hadn't noticed before, where newer pictographs had been painted over older ones. The fresh paintings depicted a woman with light hair tending to wounded figures, her hands glowing with what appeared to be healing power. Beside these images were symbols that Tachi began to translate, his finger tracing each mark with reverence. "The cave spirits spoke of your coming," he explained slowly, searching for English words. They said a white medicine woman would save a Comanche warrior when the steel trap bit deep. The prophecy is 3 winters old. Hannah stared at the paintings in growing amazement and unease. The resemblance to their recent ordeal was uncanny, down to details like the bear trap and the storm that had driven them to shelter. Someone had predicted their meeting with startling accuracy, but the implications were deeply unsettling. If Comanche seers had foreseen these events, what else had they predicted about her future? Tachi continued his translation, his expression growing more serious with each symbol he read. The prophecy speaks of great danger coming to both our peoples. A war that will consume the mountains and plains, leaving only death in its wake. But it also speaks of hope, 2 hearts joining across the divide, creating a bridge that hatred cannot burn. His eyes met Hannah's as he finished, searching her face for understanding. The weight of prophecy sat heavy between them as Hannah processed what she had heard. She had always been skeptical of fortune-telling and mysticism, her father's scientific training having instilled in her a preference for observable facts over supernatural speculation. Yet the accuracy of the cave paintings was impossible to dismiss, and the timing of their meeting stretched coincidence beyond reasonable limits. As if summoned by their discussion of prophecy, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the canyon below. Hannah crept to the cave entrance and peered down to see a sight that made her blood run cold. Colonel Thomas Morrison himself, leading a column of 20 cavalry soldiers through the narrow passage. Her brother-in-law's presence could mean only one thing. The bounty hunters had reported their encounter to the territorial commander. Hannah pulled back from the entrance and whispered urgently to Tachi, "My husband's brother leads those soldiers. He's the one who pays bounties for Comanche scalps, and he'll kill us both if he finds us together." The warrior's expression hardened at this news, his hand instinctively reaching for weapons that were no longer there. Despite his injuries, the mention of scalp hunters brought out the predator in him. The column paused directly below their hiding place, and Hannah could hear Colonel Morrison's voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Garrett says the trail went cold here, but I know these canyons. There are dozens of caves and overhangs where a wounded brave could hole up. We'll search them systematically until we find either him or his body." The methodical certainty in his voice left no doubt about his intentions. Tachi struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the pain from his injured ankle. "I will not let you suffer for helping me," he whispered fiercely. "Give me to them and save yourself. A warrior's death is better than letting innocence be punished." The offer was made with genuine nobility, but Hannah could see the cost it extracted from his warrior's pride. "No," Hannah replied firmly, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. "I didn't risk everything to save your life, just to hand you over to murderers. We'll find another way." As she spoke, she realized that somewhere during their shared ordeal, her feelings toward Tachi had shifted from simple medical duty to something deeper and more personal. The search began in earnest, with soldiers spreading out to investigate every possible hiding place in the canyon walls. Hannah could hear their voices echoing off stone as they called back and forth, reporting empty caves and false trails. It would be hours before they worked their way up to the sacred cave. But discovery was inevitable unless she could create another diversion. Inspiration struck as Hannah remembered something her father had mentioned about the cave systems in this region. Many were connected by narrow passages that honeycombed the entire mountain. If she could find such a connection, they might be able to escape without ever showing themselves to the searchers below. The risk was enormous, as getting lost in unmapped tunnels could mean a slow death by starvation. But it was better than certain execution. Tachi watched with growing alarm as Hannah began exploring the deeper recesses of their shelter, her movements growing more desperate as she searched for some sign of a connecting passage. "What do you seek?" he asked, his English careful but clear. When she explained her plan, his expression shifted from confusion to something approaching awe. "You would risk the spirit paths for my sake," he said slowly, studying her face in the firelight. "Among my people, only the bravest warriors dare enter the sacred tunnels, and many who try are never seen again. The mountain spirits guard their secrets jealously, despite his warning." There was admiration in his voice, and perhaps something deeper. The entrance to the spirit paths proved to be hidden behind a natural curtain of stone formations at the very back of the cave. Hannah might have missed it entirely, if not for a faint current of air that suggested an opening beyond the apparent dead end. Working together despite his injuries, she and Tachi managed to squeeze through the narrow gap into a tunnel that disappeared into absolute darkness. The passage beyond was barely wide enough for them to move single file, with a ceiling so low that even Hannah had to duck in places. Tachi's injured ankle made every step an ordeal, but he endured the pain without complaint, understanding as well as she did that their lives depended on putting distance between themselves and Colonel Morrison's searchers. Navigation in the tunnels required all of Hannah's frontier skills and more than a little luck. She had brought burning branches from their fire to serve as torches, but the light they provided was limited and constantly threatened by air currents that could extinguish their flames without warning. Several times they were forced to feel their way through sections where the ceiling was too low for upright torches. An hour into their underground journey, they reached a junction where 3 different passages branched off in different directions. Hannah studied each opening carefully, looking for any sign that might indicate which path led toward the surface. The choice they made here could mean the difference between freedom and becoming lost forever in the mountain's stone heart. Tachi proved invaluable at this critical moment, using senses honed by years of tracking and wilderness survival. He tested the air currents from each passage, feeling for subtle differences in temperature and humidity that might indicate proximity to the surface. Finally, he pointed to the leftmost tunnel with quiet confidence. "This path breathes with the outside world," he said simply. The passage he had chosen proved to be the most challenging yet, with sections where they had to crawl on hands and knees through openings barely large enough for human bodies. Anna's medical bag caught on projecting stones several times, and she was forced to repack its contents to reduce its bulk. Behind her, she could hear Tachi's labored breathing as his injured leg made every movement an exercise in endurance. Their underground ordeal was finally rewarded when Hannah caught sight of genuine daylight filtering down from somewhere ahead. The tunnel began to angle upward more steeply, and she could feel fresh air on her face for the first time in hours. When they finally emerged into sunlight, they found themselves on a high ledge overlooking a completely different canyon system. The view from their new vantage point revealed the full scope of Colonel Morrison's search operation. Soldiers were methodically working their way through the canyon where they had sheltered, investigating every possible hiding place with military precision. Smoke rose from several locations where caves were being smoked out to force any occupants into the open. Hannah and Tachi watched in fascination as the colonel himself entered the sacred cave they had recently vacated. Even from their distant perch, they could see his reaction when he discovered the pictographs and the still warm ashes of their fire. His gestures were animated as he called his subordinates over to examine the evidence of their recent occupation. "He knows we were there," Hannah whispered, though they were too far away for normal voices to carry. "And he knows we escaped somehow. He'll tear this entire mountain apart looking for us now." The intensity of the search below confirmed her fears. This was no longer a routine bounty hunt, but a personal crusade for the colonel. Tachi studied the military formation with the tactical eye of an experienced warrior. "Your brother seeks more than bounty money," he observed quietly. "This is the hunt of a man with blood debt to settle. What did you take from him that burns so hot in his heart?" The question was perceptive, cutting to the heart of motivations Hannah had been trying to avoid examining. The truth was complicated and painful. Colonel Morrison had always blamed her for his brother Thomas's death, claiming that if she had been a proper frontier wife, instead of playing at being a doctor, Thomas would never have been out alone when the Cheyenne War Party found him. Her subsequent flight west to practice medicine independently had been seen as the ultimate betrayal of everything the Morrison family stood for. As if reading her thoughts, Tachi reached over and gently took her hand in his. The contact was electric, sending warmth up her arm despite the cool mountain air. "Guilt is a poison that kills slowly," he said softly. "I have carried it for my own losses, but healing cannot begin while the heart bleeds inward." His words carried the weight of personal experience with grief and self-blame. The intimate moment was shattered by the appearance of a lone rider approaching the canyon from the east. Hannah recognized the horse before she could make out its rider, her own mare Copper, being ridden by someone who clearly knew the animal well. As the figure drew closer, her heart sank as she identified Deputy Marshal Jake Harrison, Colonel Morrison's most trusted scout. Harrison's arrival at the canyon entrance caused immediate activity among the searching soldiers. Hannah could see him pointing toward the high country where she and Tachi currently hid, his gestures indicating that he had found their trail despite all their precautions. The deputy marshal had always been the best tracker in the territory, and it appeared that even their passage through the spirit tunnels had left signs he could follow. "We need to move," Hannah said urgently, already gathering her medical supplies for another flight. But when she looked at Tachi, she could see that his strength was nearly exhausted. The underground journey had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit, and his injured ankle was swollen almost beyond the confines of her improvised bandages. Tachi saw her assessment and made a decision that spoke to his warrior's heart. "Leave me here," he said firmly. "I will hold them as long as possible while you escape to safety. It is a good place to make a final stand, with honor intact." He gestured toward the narrow ledge that could be defended by a single determined fighter. "I'm not leaving you," Hannah replied with equal firmness, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "We've come too far together to give up now. There has to be another way." As she spoke, her eyes were already scanning the surrounding terrain for any possible route of escape that wouldn't require abandoning her patient. The solution came from an unexpected source. The pictographs in the sacred cave had included a map of sorts, showing the location of other spirit paths throughout the mountain system. If Hannah could remember the symbols correctly, there should be another tunnel entrance somewhere on this very ledge, hidden among the natural rock formations, working frantically against time. Hannah began searching every crevice and shadow on their precarious perch. Tachi watched her efforts with growing understanding, and despite his exhaustion, began helping with the search. Their desperate hunt was rewarded when he discovered a gap between two boulders that opened into another passage. The new tunnel was different from the one they had traveled before, wider and more regular, as if it had been deliberately carved rather than formed by natural processes. Ancient tool marks on the walls suggested that generations of Comanche had used this route for purposes Hannah could only guess at. The air flowing through it carried scents of pine and sage, promising an exit into the high country. As they prepared to enter their second underground journey of the day, Hannah paused to look back at the canyon where Colonel Morrison's soldiers continued their methodical search. Somewhere in that maze of stone and shadow, her old life was being hunted to extinction. Whatever emerged from these spirit paths would be something entirely new, a woman transformed by courage and an impossible connection that transcended every boundary her world recognized. The ancient Comanche tunnel delivered Hannah and Tachi into a world they had never expected to find. A hidden valley nestled high in the Colorado Rockies, completely invisible from the surrounding peaks. Emerald grass carpeted the valley floor, fed by a crystal stream that wound between groves of aspen and pine. More shocking still were the dozens of horses grazing peacefully in this natural paradise, their coats gleaming with health and careful tending. Tachi's sharp intake of breath told Hannah that this discovery was as unexpected for him as it was for her. The lost herd of Chief Running Bear, he whispered in amazement, his voice carrying profound reverence. 20 winters ago, when the blue coats came to drive us from our sacred lands, the chief gathered our finest horses and hid them where no white man could steal them. The location died with him at Sand Creek. The implications struck Hannah like a physical blow. This hidden valley contained what might be the most valuable horse herd in the entire territory, bloodlines that could establish a fortune for whoever controlled them. More importantly, the horses represented the living legacy of a murdered chief, preserved against impossible odds in this secret sanctuary. No wonder the ancient tunnels had been so carefully maintained. Their moment of wonder was shattered by the sound of gunfire echoing from the canyon they had just escaped. Hannah counted at least 6 distinct weapons, firing in rapid succession, the reports bouncing off stone walls in a deadly symphony that spoke of serious combat rather than target practice. Colonel Morrison's soldiers had encountered something that was fighting back with considerable skill. The battle sounds intensified, with the crack of military carbines being answered by the distinctive boom of larger caliber weapons. Apache listened to the exchange with the trained ear of a warrior who had survived countless skirmishes. "Buffalo guns," he identified grimly. "Someone down there has Sharp's rifles and knows how to use them. Your brother has found more than he bargained for." As if summoned by the sound of conflict, a group of riders emerged from the trees at the far end of the hidden valley. Hannah's heart nearly stopped as she counted 12 mounted warriors in full war paint, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. For a terrifying moment she thought they had stumbled into a Comanche war party. But then she noticed something that changed everything. Several of the riders were clearly white men. The leader of this mixed band was a figure that seemed to step directly out of frontier legend, a giant of a man with steel-grey hair and scars that spoke of a lifetime spent in violent places. When he dismounted near Hannah and Tachi, his movements carried the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable in savage wilderness or civilized drawing room. His eyes, pale blue and utterly without mercy, fixed on them with predatory interest. "Well now," the man said in a cultured voice that carried just a trace of southern accent, "what have we here? A lady doctor and her pet Indian, fresh from the tunnels, if I'm reading the signs correctly." The casual menace in his tone made Hannah's skin crawl, but it was his next words that truly chilled her blood. "I do believe you're the reason Colonel Morrison is making such a fuss down in my canyon." Hannah found her voice despite her fear. "Your canyon?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The man's smile was all predator, confirming her worst fears about what they had stumbled into. This was no random encounter, but a meeting with the architect of the territory's most carefully orchestrated crimes, Marcus Dalton. He introduced himself with a mocking bow that somehow made his courtesy more threatening than open hostility. "Perhaps you've heard of me in connection with certain unfortunate incidents involving wagon trains and missing cavalry patrols. I've made quite a reputation for myself in these mountains, though I do prefer to work behind the scenes." The name hit Hannah like a physical blow. Marcus Dalton was the ghost story that parents used to frighten children into staying close to camp, a former Confederate colonel who had turned outlaw after the war, building an empire based on selling stolen horses to buyers who asked no questions. His band included renegades from half a dozen tribes, bound together by shared hatred of the federal government. Tachi struggled to his feet despite his injuries, his warrior's instincts overriding physical weakness when faced with a legendary enemy. Even wounded and weaponless, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who refused to show fear in the face of death. Dalton studied him with professional interest, like a connoisseur evaluating a particularly fine specimen. "A Comanche brave," Dalton mused aloud, "and from his bearing, one of some importance. Tell me, warrior, does your presence here have anything to do with Chief Running Bear's lost herd?" When Tachi remained silent, Dalton's expression hardened. "I've spent 5 years searching these mountains for those horses. Imagine my surprise to discover that the secret lay not in finding the herd, but in following someone who already knew where to look. The accusation was unfair and illogical, but Hannah could see that Dalton had already constructed a narrative that suited his purposes. In his version of events, she and Tachi were advanced scouts for a larger Comanche force planning to reclaim the hidden horses. The fact that this theory made no sense would not stop him from acting on it. One of Dalton's men, a scarred half-breed with the cold eyes of a born killer, leaned close to whisper something urgent in his leader's ear. Whatever news he brought caused Dalton's expression to shift from casual menace to focused attention. "It seems Colonel Morrison's boys have found our back trail," he announced to his assembled riders. "They're following the canyon up toward this valley, and they're making better time than expected." The tactical situation was becoming clearer by the moment, and none of it boded well for Hannah and Tachi's survival. They were trapped between two equally dangerous forces: Colonel Morrison's military patrol seeking vengeance, and Marcus Dalton's outlaw band protecting their stolen empire. Either group would kill them without hesitation, though for entirely different reasons. Dalton made his decision with the swift calculation of a man accustomed to violence. "Bind them both," he ordered his men. "The woman might be useful as a hostage if Morrison gets too close, and the brave has information I need about Comanche movements in this area. We'll sort out their true value once we've dealt with the immediate threat." Hannah found herself roughly seized by two of Dalton's men, her medical bag torn from her grasp and scattered across the valley floor. She tried to intervene despite his injuries, but was quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. The ease with which they were captured spoke to the professional efficiency of Dalton's organization. These were not common bandits, but military veterans operating with deadly precision. As rope bit into her wrists, Hannah caught sight of something that gave her a desperate spark of hope. Hidden among the scattered contents of her medical bag was the small clay pot of war paint that Tachi had carried from the sacred cave. If she could somehow signal him about its location, the Comanche warrior might be able to use it to communicate with any of his people who might be in the area. The sound of approaching cavalry grew louder, echoing off the valley walls as Colonel Morrison's patrol worked their way up the canyon toward the hidden entrance. Dalton listened to their progress with the focused attention of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. 20 men, maybe 25, he estimated aloud, moving fast but not particularly quietly. The good colonel never did learn proper fieldcraft. The criticism of Morrison's military skills carried personal venom that suggested a history between the two men. Hannah remembered stories about Confederate irregulars who had continued fighting long after Appomattox, turning their military expertise to criminal purposes when the official war ended. Dalton's hatred for federal authority clearly ran deeper than simple greed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Tachi had been bound and forced to his knees beside Hannah, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every detail of their surroundings with the methodical precision of a warrior, planning either escape or revenge. When his gaze fell on the scattered war paint, Hannah saw a flicker of understanding pass across his features. The confrontation they all sensed coming was delayed by an unexpected complication. A lone rider approaching the valley from the opposite direction, moving with the confident pace of someone who belonged in this dangerous territory. Dalton's men immediately raised their weapons, but relaxed when they recognized the newcomer as one of their own scouts. The scout brought news that changed everything. "Chief Iron Wolf is 3 miles south with 40 warriors," he reported breathlessly. "They're tracking the missing horses, and they've picked up the cavalry's trail. Both groups are headed straight for this valley, and they'll be here before sunset." The prospect of a three-way battle in the confined space of the hidden valley clearly troubled even Dalton's veteran outlaws. Hannah's mind raced as she processed this new information. Chief Iron Wolf was Tachi's father, a detail she had learned during their cave conversations. The approaching Comanche war party wasn't hunting stolen horses, but searching for a missing warrior. The convergence of 3 hostile forces in one small valley promised to create a bloodbath that would leave no survivors. Dalton's reaction to the scouts' news revealed the tactical brilliance that had kept him alive and prosperous for so long. Instead of panic, he displayed calm calculation as he worked through the implications of the developing situation. Iron Wolf wants his son back. Morrison wants revenge on the woman, and I want everyone dead who knows about this valley. Seems like we might be able to arrange a solution that satisfies everyone. The plan Dalton began outlining was diabolically clever in its simplicity. He would use Hannah and Tachi as bait to draw both the cavalry and the war party into the valley, then position his men to catch both groups in a deadly crossfire. The stolen horses would provide cover for his escape, while the massacre of federal troops and Comanche warriors would eliminate any witnesses to his operation. As preparations for the ambush began around them, Hannah searched desperately for any possible escape from the trap that was tightening around them all. The hidden valley that had seemed like paradise was about to become a killing ground, and she could see no way to prevent the slaughter that Dalton was orchestrating with such cold precision. Tachi caught her eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward a section of the valley wall where shadows suggested another cave entrance. His message was clear: if an opportunity arose, they should try to reach that potential shelter. But with armed guards watching their every move, any escape attempt would require a distraction of considerable magnitude. The distraction came from an unexpected source: the horses themselves. Chief Running Bear's legendary herd had survived in this valley for 20 years by developing an almost supernatural sensitivity to danger. As the sounds of approaching conflict grew louder, the animals began displaying signs of extreme agitation, moving in tight circles and whinnying with alarm. The lead mare, a magnificent paint horse that must have been Running Bear's personal mount, suddenly reared on her hind legs and trumpeted a warning call that echoed off the valley walls. The other horses immediately responded, forming a tight defensive circle with the foals protected in the center, a formation that spoke of intelligence far beyond normal animal instincts. Dalton cursed as he realized that the horses' behavior would alert both approaching groups to the presence of the hidden valley long before he was ready to spring his trap. The element of surprise that his entire plan depended on was evaporating with each passing moment, leaving him exposed to enemies approaching from 2 different directions. In the chaos created by the frightened horses, Hannah saw Tachi make his move. Despite his bound hands and injured ankle, the Comanche warrior somehow managed to reach the scattered war paint and palm the small clay pot. Working with desperate speed, he broke the wax seal and began applying the sacred pigments to his face. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. The wounded man she had been tending became something altogether more primal, a Comanche war chief preparing for battle with all the spiritual power of his ancestors flowing through him. Even Dalton's hardened outlaws stepped back involuntarily as Tachi's war cry split the air like a blade. The sound carried incredible distance in the mountain air, reaching both the approaching cavalry and the Comanche war party with unmistakable meaning. Hannah might not speak the language, but she understood the message perfectly. Iron Wolf's son was alive, in danger, and calling for immediate assistance from anyone who could hear his voice. Tachi's war cry still echoed off the canyon walls when the first shots rang out from the eastern approach to the valley. Colonel Morrison's cavalry had encountered Dalton's outer sentries, and the sharp crack of Spencer carbines mixed with the deeper boom of outlaw rifles in a deadly symphony that spoke of no quarter asked or given. Hannah watched in fascination and horror as Marcus Dalton transformed from casual menace into military commander, his voice cutting through the chaos with orders that moved his men like pieces on a chessboard. The legendary horses of Chief Running Bear responded to the gunfire with an intelligence that bordered on supernatural. Instead of panicking and scattering as normal animals would, they moved in coordinated groups toward defensive positions among the rocks and trees, as if they remembered battles fought 20 years ago. The lead mare positioned herself between the approaching danger and the valley's sacred burial grounds, her eyes blazing with protective fury. From the western rim of the valley came an answering war cry that made Tachi's call seem like a whisper. Chief Iron Wolf announcing his arrival with 40 seasoned warriors at his back. Hannah had never heard anything like it. A sound that seemed to awaken every predatory instinct buried in human DNA. Even Dalton's hardened outlaws shifted nervously as that primal scream promised death to anyone who threatened the chief's blood. The tactical situation evolved with lightning speed as three separate forces maneuvered for advantage in the confined space of the hidden valley. Dalton's men held the high ground along the northern rim, their rifles commanding the open grassland where the horses grazed. Morrison's cavalry was fighting their way up the eastern canyon, their blue uniforms making them easy targets against the red sandstone walls. Iron Wolf's warriors poured down the western slopes like an avalanche of death, their war paint and feathers creating a terrifying spectacle. Hannah found herself at the center of a military engagement, unlike anything in the history of the American frontier. This wasn't the typical cavalry charge or wagon train defense that filled dime novels, but a complex three-way battle where alliances could shift in an instant, and survival depended on reading the constantly changing tactical landscape. The air filled with gun smoke and war cries as ancient hatreds collided in the shadow of the sacred mountains. The first casualty of the battle was Dalton's carefully planned ambush. With enemies approaching from two directions simultaneously, he couldn't maintain the coordinated positions necessary for a proper crossfire. His men found themselves fighting a defensive action instead of the massacre they had prepared for. And the psychological advantage shifted toward the two forces converging on their position. Tachi used the chaos of battle to work on his bonds, the rawhide strips cutting into his wrists as he strained against them. The war paint on his face seemed to glow with inner fire, transforming him into something that transcended the wounded man Hannah had been treating. When their eyes met across the smoky battlefield, she saw not just determination, but a kind of spiritual awakening, as if combat had reconnected him with powers he had forgotten he possessed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from the eastern canyon announced Colonel Morrison's successful breakthrough of Dalton's outer defenses. Hannah's heart sank as she saw her brother-in-law leading his cavalry in a classic mounted charge across the valley floor, sabers gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Whatever his faults as a human being, Morrison was a brilliant military tactician who understood how to use terrain and momentum to maximum advantage. Iron Wolf's response to the cavalry charge demonstrated why the Comanche had remained unconquered for so long, despite overwhelming odds. Instead of meeting the mounted attack head-on, his warriors melted into the landscape like smoke, using every rock and tree for cover while maintaining a deadly crossfire that began picking off troopers with surgical precision. Hannah watched in amazement as men who had seemed like savage barbarians revealed themselves to be master tacticians. The three-way battle reached its crescendo when Dalton made a desperate gamble to break the stalemate. Ordering his men to drive the sacred horses toward both enemy forces, he hoped to create enough confusion to cover his escape with the most valuable animals. The plan backfired spectacularly when the lead mare refused to be driven, instead turning to face Dalton's riders with the fury of a creature defending holy ground. What followed defied everything Hannah thought she knew about animal behavior. Chief Running Bear's legendary mount reared up on her hind legs and struck down one of Dalton's men with hooves that moved like weapons wielded by a trained warrior. The other horses joined the attack, their actions coordinated and purposeful rather than merely instinctive. It was as if the spirits of dead Comanche warriors had possessed their beloved mounts. The supernatural display had a profound effect on all three human factions engaged in combat. Iron Wolf's warriors began chanting in reverent tones, recognizing the spiritual significance of what they were witnessing. Morrison's soldiers faltered in their advance, clearly shaken by horses that fought like men. Even Dalton's hardened outlaws began backing away from animals that seemed to embody the vengeance of the murdered chief. In the midst of this chaos, Hannah saw her chance for escape. The guard assigned to watch her and Tachi had become distracted by the supernatural battle between horses and outlaws. His attention focused on the impossible spectacle unfolding before him. Working with desperate speed, she managed to reach the scattered contents of her medical bag and retrieve a scalpel that had somehow survived the earlier violence. Cutting Tachi's bonds required precious seconds that felt like hours, with bullets whining overhead and war cries echoing from all directions. The moment his hands were free, the Comanche warrior transformed from prisoner to active participant in the battle, his movements flowing with the deadly grace of someone born to combat. Despite his injured ankle, he moved across the chaotic battlefield like a force of nature. The tide of battle shifted dramatically when Taichi reached the position where Iron Wolf's warriors were engaging Morrison's cavalry. Father and son's reunion in the middle of combat was a moment of pure emotion that transcended the violence surrounding them, their embrace conveying years of separation and the joy of finding each other alive. But the touching scene lasted only seconds before both men turned their attention back to the deadly business at hand. Hannah found herself running across open ground under fire, her medical training warring with pure survival instinct as she tried to reach wounded men from all three factions who were crying out for help. A federal trooper with a shattered leg, one of Dalton's outlaws gut-shot and dying. A young Comanche warrior with a bullet through his shoulder, her healing oath recognized no boundaries of race or allegiance. The sight of a white woman tending wounded Comanche warriors had a strange effect on the battle's intensity. Colonel Morrison, whatever his other faults, had been raised as a gentleman, and the code of the frontier demanded protection of women regardless of the circumstances. His shouted orders caused his troopers to redirect their fire away from Hannah's position, creating an informal zone of medical neutrality. Dalton showed no such chivalrous restraint. Realizing that his position was becoming untenable and his escape routes were being cut off, he made one final desperate play for victory. Drawing a massive Colt Army revolver, he began working his way across the battlefield toward Hannah, clearly intending to use her as a human shield to guarantee his safe passage from the valley. The outlaw leader's approach did not go unnoticed. Both Tachi and Iron Wolf saw the threat developing and began converging on Hannah's position, their movements perfectly coordinated despite years of separation. The wounded Comanche son and his legendary father moved with the fluid precision of dancers, their war cries harmonizing in a sound that seemed to shake the very mountains. The final confrontation took place in the shadow of Chief Running Bear's burial cairn, a pile of sacred stones that had watched over the hidden valley for 2 decades. Dalton reached Hannah first, his revolver pressed against her temple as he backed toward the only remaining escape route. His eyes had the desperate gleam of a man who knew his empire was crumbling, but was determined to salvage something from the wreckage. "Nobody moves or the lady dies," Dalton shouted over the continuing gunfire, his cultured voice cracking under the strain of his deteriorating situation. The threat brought an immediate ceasefire from all three factions, creating an eerie silence, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the nervous stamping of horses. Even the sacred mare seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Iron Wolf stepped forward with the dignity befitting a great chief, his war paint and eagle feathers creating an imposing figure even in surrender. "Release the medicine woman," he commanded in clear English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "She has shown kindness to my son and honor to my people. Her blood will not purchase your freedom." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with dozens of weapons trained on the small group gathered around the burial cairn. Hannah could feel Dalton's desperation in the trembling of his gun hand, could smell the fierce sweat that soaked his clothes despite the cool mountain air. This was a man at the end of his rope, and such men were capable of anything. The resolution came from an unexpected source, Chief Running Bear's legendary mare. Moving with the silent stealth of a hunting cat, she approached Dalton from behind, her hooves making no sound on the soft valley grass. When she was within striking distance, the sacred horse reared up and brought her front hooves down on the outlaw's shoulders with crushing force. Dalton's scream of pain and surprise shattered the tense silence as he was driven to his knees by the horse's attack. His revolver flew from nerveless fingers to land harmlessly in the grass, leaving him defenseless before the three forces he had tried to manipulate. The sacred mare stood over him like an avenging spirit, her eyes blazing with intelligence that seemed almost human. The aftermath of the battle brought unexpected revelations as the three factions sorted through their dead and wounded. Colonel Morrison, approaching under a flag of truce to retrieve his casualties, found himself face to face with the brother-in-law he had hunted across half the territory. His reaction to seeing Hannah alive and unharmed revealed depths of emotion she had never suspected he possessed. "I thought you were dead," Morrison admitted quietly, his military bearing cracking to reveal the grieving man beneath. "When Thomas died, I blamed everyone except the real enemy, war itself. I've spent 3 years hunting shadows, while the woman my brother loved most was trying to heal the wounds that hatred creates." The admission cost him greatly, but Hannah could see that it also lifted a burden he had carried too long. Iron Wolf's reaction to Hannah was equally revealing. The great chief studied her with eyes that seemed to look directly into her soul, weighing everything he saw against some internal standard. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "The sacred cave foretold your coming, medicine woman. My son lives because you chose healing over hatred. The debt between our peoples is balanced. The division of Dalton's captured horses created an unexpected moment of cooperation between former enemies. Iron Wolf claimed those animals that belonged to his people by right of blood, while Morrison agreed to return stolen cavalry mounts to their proper units. The remaining horses, those that had been legitimately purchased by Dalton before his criminal career began, were awarded to Hannah in recognition of her role in ending the outlaw's reign of terror. As the sun began to set over the hidden valley, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the three factions prepared to go their separate ways. But something fundamental had changed in the relationship between them, a recognition that enemies could become allies when faced with common threats. The sacred burial ground had witnessed not just violence, but transformation. Hannah found herself standing beside Tachi as his father's warriors prepared for their journey back to the reservation. The Comanche warrior's ankle was healing well under her continued care, but she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. He was torn between duty to his people and something deeper that had grown during their shared ordeal. The moment of decision arrived when Iron Wolf approached his son with a question that would determine both their futures. "Will you ride with us, my son? Or has the medicine woman's healing power claimed more than just your wounds?" The chief's eyes held understanding rather than accusation. He had seen how Tachi looked at Hannah and recognized the signs of a heart divided. Tachi's answer came not in words, but in action. Taking Hannah's hand in his, he faced his father with quiet dignity. "The prophecy spoke of two hearts joining across the divide," he said simply. "I choose to honor that vision, even if it means walking a path that neither of our peoples has traveled before." The declaration was made with the gravity of a man staking everything on love. The winter of 1879 transformed the Colorado Territory into a crystalline wonderland that sparkled under endless blue skies. But Hannah Morrison, she had reclaimed her married name with pride, barely noticed the beauty surrounding her new home. The ranch she and Tachi had built together in the valley adjacent to the sacred horse grounds represented something unprecedented. On the American frontier, a place where two cultures had truly merged, rather than merely coexisted. The main house itself told the story of their unique partnership, combining Hannah's practical frontier architecture with Tachi's understanding of how buildings should harmonize with the natural world. Traditional log construction supported walls decorated with Comanche symbols that told the story of their courtship, while a medical clinic occupied the eastern wing where Hannah treated patients from both white settlements and Indian reservations without regard for their ability to pay. Chief Ironwolf had surprised everyone by not only blessing his son's marriage to a white woman, but actively supporting the establishment of their cross-cultural community. The great chief understood better than most that the old ways of constant warfare were ending, and that survival would require adaptation rather than resistance. Hannah's ranch became a neutral ground where former enemies could meet safely to trade, negotiate, and slowly learn to see each other as fellow human beings. The success of their experimental community had attracted attention from the highest levels of territorial government. Governor John Evans himself had made the journey from Denver to witness what many called the Morrison Miracle, a place where scalp hunters and war chiefs sat down to dinner together, where Comanche medicine men shared healing knowledge with a white woman doctor, where children of both races played together without the hatred their parents had inherited. Hannah's medical practice had evolved far beyond anything she could have imagined during her early years as a frontier doctor. Working alongside Tachi and his father's medicine men, she had learned to combine traditional Western medicine with ancient Comanche healing arts, creating treatments that were more effective than either approach alone. Her clinic's reputation for miraculous cures had spread across 3 territories, bringing patients from hundreds of miles away. The integration of healing traditions had produced remarkable results, particularly in treating the psychological wounds that plagued both cultures after decades of warfare. Veterans of Indian campaigns found peace through Comanche purification rituals, while young warriors struggling with the transition to reservation life discovered purpose in learning Hannah's medical techniques. The exchange of knowledge flowed both ways, creating something entirely new on the American frontier. Marcus Dalton's trial in Denver had become a sensation that dominated newspaper headlines across the nation, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Instead of a simple case of frontier justice, the proceedings had evolved into a broader examination of the policies that had created men like Dalton in the first place. Hannah's testimony about the systematic corruption in the territorial bounty system had triggered congressional investigations that reached all the way to Washington. The legal aftermath of Dalton's capture had produced unexpected benefits for the Morrison Ranch community. The federal government, eager to demonstrate its commitment to peaceful relations with Indian tribes, had designated their settlement as an official experiment in cultural integration. This status brought government funding for Hannah's medical work and protection from hostile elements who viewed their success as a threat to the established order. Colonel Morrison's transformation following the events in the Sacred Valley had been perhaps the most remarkable change of all. Thomas's brother had resigned his military commission to become the territorial's first Indian Affairs liaison, using his military experience to create fair policies rather than implement punitive ones. His quarterly visits to the ranch had evolved from official inspections into family gatherings that bridged old wounds. The horses that had been awarded to Hannah following Dalton's defeat had become the foundation of a breeding program that was revolutionizing frontier transportation. By crossing Chief Running Bear's legendary bloodlines with the finest cavalry mounts, they were producing animals that combined Comanche endurance with military training. The resulting horses were sought after from California to the Mississippi, providing economic independence for their growing community. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities as word of the Morrison Ranch's success reached immigrant communities struggling to establish themselves in the harsh frontier environment. Scandinavian farmers, Irish railroad workers, and German craftsmen began arriving at their gates seeking the medical care and cultural tolerance that had become their community's trademark. Each new arrival added complexity to their social experiment. The arrival of these diverse immigrant groups created unexpected tensions that tested the foundations of everything Hannah and Tachi had built together. Some of the European settlers brought old-world prejudices against both Indians and strong-willed women, while others struggled to adapt to a community where traditional hierarchies had been replaced by cooperation and mutual respect. Hannah found herself serving as mediator in conflicts she had never anticipated. Tachi's role in managing these cultural tensions revealed leadership abilities that even his father hadn't fully recognized. The young warrior, who had once defined himself solely through combat prowess, discovered that he possessed a gift for diplomacy that made him invaluable in negotiating between competing interests. His ability to communicate in 4 languages, Comanche, English, Spanish, and German, made him the natural bridge between communities. The most significant test of their community's resilience came when a delegation of Comanche chiefs arrived to evaluate whether Iron Wolf's son had abandoned his heritage by marrying a white woman. Led by the formidable Chief Quanapaka, these visitors came prepared to judge whether Tachi's choices had dishonored his people or pointed toward a viable future for all Indians facing the changing world. Hannah prepared for this crucial visit with the same meticulous care she brought to complex medical procedures, understanding that the future of their entire community might depend on the impression they made. She studied Comanche customs with Tachi's guidance, learning the proper protocols for honoring guests, while demonstrating that respect for his culture had been integral to their relationship from the beginning. The week-long evaluation by Chief Quanapaka's delegation became a masterclass in cultural diplomacy that would be studied by government officials for years to come. Hannah demonstrated her medical skills by treating several ailments that had plagued the visiting chiefs, while Tachi showed how white agricultural techniques could supplement traditional hunting without abandoning spiritual connections to the land. The turning point in the chief's evaluation came when Hannah was called upon to assist with a difficult childbirth in the Comanche camp. Working alongside traditional midwives, she helped deliver twins whose survival had seemed impossible using conventional methods alone. The successful birth, achieved through the combination of Western medical knowledge and Comanche spiritual practices, demonstrated the power of cultural synthesis. Chief Quanapaka's final judgment exceeded even Hannah's most optimistic hopes. Speaking before a gathering that included representatives from 5 different tribes and 3 territorial governments, he declared that Tachi and Hannah had created something that honored both their traditions, while pointing toward a future where all peoples could thrive together. The endorsement carried weight throughout Indian territory. The official recognition of their community's success brought new responsibilities and opportunities that neither Hannah nor Tachi had anticipated. The federal government invited them to establish similar communities in other territories, while Eastern universities offered positions that would allow them to teach their integration methods to a new generation of frontier leaders. Each opportunity required careful consideration of their commitment to the home they had built. Personal happiness accompanied their public success, as Hannah discovered she was carrying their first child. The pregnancy, coming after 2 years of marriage, represented the literal creation of the next generation that would inherit the world they were building. Tachi's joy at the prospect of fatherhood was matched by his determination to ensure their child would grow up in a world better than the one they had known. The baby's birth during the spring of 1880 became a community celebration that drew visitors from across the territory. Little Thomas Running Bear Morrison, named for Hannah's first husband and Tachi's spiritual ancestor, arrived healthy and strong, his mixed heritage visible in features that combined the best of both parents. Chief Iron Wolf declared him the bridge between worlds that the ancient prophecies had foretold. As Hannah stood on her porch, holding her son while watching Tachi work with a group of mixed-race children, learning to ride the legendary horses, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had once fled west to escape her grief had instead found a love that transcended every boundary her world recognized. The sacred cave, where their story had truly begun, had become a pilgrimage site for couples from different cultures seeking blessing for their own cross-cultural unions. Hannah and Tachi made regular visits to maintain the site and share their story with visitors, always emphasizing that their success had required constant work and compromise rather than simple romantic idealism. The pictographs that had predicted their meeting had proven to be part of a larger cycle of prophecies carved into the cave walls over centuries. Comanche seers, working with Hannah's scientific knowledge, had begun deciphering these ancient predictions, discovering that their successful union was merely the first step in a longer transformation that would reshape the entire American frontier. The business partnership between their horse breeding operation and Colonel Morrison's transportation company had grown into one of the territory's most successful enterprises. Their animals were pulling stagecoaches from Santa Fe to St. Louis, carrying mail across the Great Plains, and serving as foundation stock for cavalry remount programs. Success had brought wealth that they used to expand their community's services. Educational opportunities became their next major initiative as Hannah established the territory's first integrated school where children of all backgrounds learned together. The curriculum combined traditional academic subjects with practical skills like animal husbandry, basic medicine, and multiple languages. Graduates of the Morrison School were sought after by employers throughout the West. As their son took his first steps in the summer of 1881, Hannah and Tachi began planning the expansion that would transform their experimental community into a permanent model for frontier development. The territorial government had offered them a 1,000-acre grant to establish a full township, complete with their own post office, courthouse, and officially recognized municipal government. The establishment of Morrison Township required Hannah to run for mayor in an election that would make history as the first time a woman had sought municipal office in Colorado Territory. Her campaign, supported by voters from every cultural background in their community, focused on the practical achievements that had made their settlement a beacon of hope for thousands of frontier families. Hannah's electoral victory by an overwhelming margin sent shockwaves through territorial politics and attracted national attention to their unique community. Newspaper reporters from New York and San Francisco arrived to document what many called the Great Experiment in democratic governance. Their success challenged assumptions about both women's capabilities and racial integration. The final scene of their remarkable journey took place 5 years after that fateful day when Hannah had first heard Tachi's cry echoing across the canyon. Standing together on the same ledge where she had first seen him trapped and dying, they watched their growing township spread across the valley below, a community of over 300 souls from a dozen different backgrounds, all united by the belief that cooperation was stronger than conflict. As the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to partners to leaders of a new kind of frontier community, Hannah reflected on the truth that had emerged from their unlikely love story. She had risked her life to remove a bear trap from a wounded Comanche warrior, but in saving Tachi, she had discovered that he possessed something far more valuable than gratitude, a heart large enough to bridge any divide, and a vision bold enough to transform the American West itself. The carved wooden bird that Tachi had given her in their first cave still hung around her neck, its wings spread wide as if ready to carry their message of hope to anyone willing to listen. Their story had begun with a single act of compassion, but it had grown into something that would influence frontier development for generations to come. In a world too often divided by fear and hatred, they had proven that love truly could conquer all. 3 years after Hannah Morrison first heard a Comanche warrior's anguished cry echo across Devil's Canyon, She stood before the territorial legislature in Denver, her auburn hair now streaked with premature silver from the intensity of building something unprecedented on the American frontier. At 31, the former frontier doctor had become the most influential voice in Colorado territorial politics, the first woman to address the legislature on matters of Indian policy, her words carrying the weight of years spent proving that cooperation could triumph over conflict. The audience that filled every seat in the legislative chamber represented the highest levels of territorial government, yet Hannah felt none of the nervousness that might have overwhelmed a lesser person. She had delivered breech babies in blizzards, negotiated peace between warring factions, and built a thriving community from nothing but hope and determination. Speaking to politicians seemed almost routine by comparison, though the stakes were arguably higher than anything she had faced on the frontier. Her testimony before the territorial legislature concerned the proposed Colorado Indian Relations Act of 1881, legislation that would determine the future of tribal interactions within the territory. Hannah had been summoned to Denver specifically because the Morrison Township model had become the standard by which all other integration efforts were measured. Her words would influence policies affecting thousands of people, both Indian and white, across the rapidly changing frontier. "Honorable territorial representatives," Hannah began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I come before you not as a politician or theorist, but as someone who has lived the reality of what we can achieve when we choose understanding over fear." The simple opening belied the complexity of what she had to share, 3 intensive years of successes and setbacks. In the most ambitious social experiment in territorial history, behind her calm demeanor lay memories of incredible transformation. Morrison Township had grown from their original experimental community of 300 souls into a thriving settlement of 2,000 residents representing over 15 different cultural backgrounds. Their integrated school had produced its first graduating class of mixed heritage students, while their medical clinic had expanded into a full hospital serving patients from across 3 territories. The economic success of their community had exceeded even the most optimistic projections from territorial planners. The Morrison Horse Company now supplied animals to buyers from New Mexico to Montana, while their medical training program had begun producing frontier doctors who combined traditional and modern healing methods. Most remarkably, their crime rate remained virtually non-existent, a testament to the power of inclusive community building. Tai Chi, now 34 and serving his first term as elected town council president, watched from the gallery with quiet pride as his wife addressed the territorial leaders. The wounded warrior she had saved from a bear trap had evolved into a respected community leader, his bilingual abilities and deep understanding of both cultures making him invaluable in local disputes and territorial negotiations. Their children had become symbols of America's evolving frontier. Thomas Running Bear Morrison, now 3 years old, was already displaying the intellectual curiosity that came from being raised in 2 cultures simultaneously. His baby sister Sarah Medicine Eagle Morrison, born just 6 months ago, represented the next generation that would inherit the integrated world her parents were building through sheer determination and love. The Morrison children's early development had inspired several other mixed heritage families to settle in their community, gradually creating a generation of children who saw cultural diversity as normal rather than exceptional. Hannah's insistence on teaching both Comanche and English in their household had created a template that other families were beginning to adopt throughout the territory. Chief Iron Wolf, now in his 60s but still vigorous and commanding respect throughout the territory, had lived to see his son become an elected community leader and his daughter-in-law emerge as a powerful voice for integration policies. The old chief's prophecies about bridges between worlds were proving remarkably prescient, though even he was amazed by how quickly the 2 cultures were learning to work together. Hannah's legislative testimony drew heavily on specific examples from their community's 3-year history, providing concrete evidence that integration could work when properly supported and implemented. She spoke of the German immigrant family whose engineering expertise had improved irrigation systems for both white settlers and Comanche farmers, of the former Confederate soldier who had found redemption through partnership with Indian horse breeders, the medical breakthroughs achieved through the integration of traditional Indian healing with Western scientific methods were already attracting attention from doctors and hospitals across the Western territories. Hannah's preliminary papers on combining herbal remedies with surgical techniques were being studied by frontier physicians, potentially revolutionizing treatment of everything from gunshot wounds to childhood diseases. Perhaps most importantly, Hannah addressed the psychological healing that had occurred within their community over the past 3 years. Veterans of Indian wars had found peace through participation in Comanche purification ceremonies. While young warriors struggling with reservation, life had discovered purpose in learning modern agricultural and business methods. The cycle of violence that had defined frontier relations for generations was being broken through patient, persistent efforts at mutual understanding. The economic data Hannah presented to the legislature was compelling evidence of integration's practical benefits. Morrison Township's per capita income exceeded that of most established territorial settlements. Their educational statistics surpassed territorial averages, and their innovations in everything from mining techniques to agricultural methods had contributed significantly to regional development. Success had bred success, attracting investment and immigration that fueled continued growth. Colonel Morrison, now retired from military service but still active in territorial business affairs, had become one of Hannah's strongest supporters in Denver political circles. His transformation from Indian fighter to integration advocate had lent credibility to their cause among military and political leaders who might otherwise have dismissed their achievements as naive idealism. His endorsement carried considerable weight in the corridors of territorial power. The challenges Hannah acknowledged in her testimony were as important as the successes she celebrated. Building an integrated community had required constant vigilance against those who preferred the old ways of segregation and conflict. They had faced threats from white supremacist groups, occasional raids by hostile Indian bands, and bureaucratic obstacles from territorial officials who viewed their success as a threat to established order. Marcus Dalton's legacy continued to influence their community in unexpected ways. The outlaw's trial had exposed corruption that reached high levels of territorial government, leading to reforms that made communities like Morrison Township possible. His captured assets, awarded to his victims through civil litigation, had provided crucial funding for many of their most successful integration programs. The legal precedents established through their community's incorporation and governance had become models for territorial law throughout the West. Hannah's role as an influential community leader had opened doors for women's political participation across the territory, while Tachi's election as council president had established new precedents for Indian political rights and representation. Hannah's address to the legislature concluded with a challenge that resonated throughout the chamber. The choice before us is not whether different peoples can live together successfully. We have proven that they can. The question is whether we will have the wisdom and courage to embrace policies that nurture such success, or whether we will cling to failed approaches that perpetuate conflict and waste human potential. The standing ovation that followed Hannah's testimony lasted nearly 5 minutes, with representatives from both parties acknowledging the power of her message and the undeniable evidence she had presented. Editorial writers across the territory would describe her address as one of the most influential speeches of the era, comparable to the great orations that had shaped territorial policy during the Indian Wars. Nakitesti yo kutil. The Colorado Indian Relations Act that emerged from legislative deliberations bore the clear influence of Hannah's testimony and the Morrison Township model. Key provisions encouraged cooperative development projects while protecting tribal traditions, supported integrated education while maintaining cultural identity, and established legal frameworks for shared governance that balanced Indian autonomy with territorial authority. Following their Denver triumph, Hannah and Tachi returned to Colorado for a celebration that drew visitors from across the territory. The festivities centered around the sacred cave where their love story had begun, now recognized by territorial authorities as a historic site. Hundreds of people made the journey to the spot where a simple act of compassion had changed the course of frontier development. The cave's pictographs had been carefully preserved and studied by territorial scholars, working with Comanche elders to decode their full meaning. The prophecies that had predicted Hannah and Tachi's meeting had proven to be part of an elaborate cycle of predictions about the territory's future, many of which were still unfolding as Colorado moved toward statehood. Their young children, now old enough to walk through the sacred cave, had begun asking questions about the bear trap that had started everything. Hannah had preserved the actual trap in their home as a reminder of how their story began, along with mementos from their courtship and early years building their community. These items served as touchstones for understanding how individual choices could shape local history. The Morrison Foundation, established with proceeds from their various business enterprises, had begun funding similar integration experiments in other territories. From Arizona to Wyoming, communities were attempting to replicate their success with varying degrees of achievement. Each new attempt added to the growing body of knowledge about effective cross-cultural cooperation and community building. Educational institutions across the territory had begun studying the Morrison model as part of their curricula in government and social development. The University of Colorado had established a scholarship program specifically for mixed heritage students, while territorial colleges had begun offering courses in frontier integration studies. Hannah's practical experiment was becoming formal academic study. The technological innovations that had emerged from their community's unique combination of cultures continued to influence territorial development. Comanche knowledge of horse breeding, combined with German engineering expertise, had produced transportation improvements that were revolutionizing Western commerce. Their medical clinic's research was advancing treatment methods that would eventually influence practice throughout the frontier. As Hannah approached her 32nd birthday, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had transformed her from a grief-stricken widow into a territorial figure whose influence was reshaping frontier policy. The woman who had once fled west to escape her pain had instead discovered that healing others was the surest path to healing oneself. That love could indeed conquer seemingly insurmountable obstacles in just a few short years. Tachi's own transformation from wounded warrior to respected community leader had paralleled Hannah's evolution, proving that individuals could transcend the limitations imposed by their circumstances and backgrounds. Their partnership had demonstrated that strength came not from dominating others, but from lifting them up. That true leadership meant serving rather than ruling the communities they had helped create. The bear trap that had nearly claimed Tachi's life in 1878 had been transformed into a symbol of hope rather than suffering. Replicas of the trap were displayed in schools throughout the territory, accompanied by the story of how one woman's courage had broken cycles of violence and hatred that had seemed eternal. Children were learning that history could be changed by individual acts of compassion and determination. Their love story had inspired countless newspaper articles and local stories that spread their message throughout the American frontier. Territorial newspapers had covered their legislative testimony extensively, while their community model was being studied by territorial administrators dealing with similar integration challenges throughout the West. The Morrison method had become a recognized approach to successful frontier development. The sacred horses of Chief Running Bear, now numbering in the dozens, continued to roam the protected valleys around Morrison Township. These animals had become living symbols of the community's success, their mixed bloodlines reflecting the human integration that surrounded them. Visitors often commented that the horses seemed to embody the spirit of cooperation that defined the entire region. As 1881 drew to a close, Hannah and Tachi began planning the next phase of their community's development. The approaching years promised new challenges and opportunities that would test everything they had built. But they faced the future with confidence, born from 3 intensive years of overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles through love, determination, and unwavering faith in human potential. The final entry in Hannah's journal, written on the 3rd anniversary of their first meeting, captured the essence of what they had accomplished together. Today, I return to the place where I first heard the cry of a trapped and dying warrior. That sound, which once spoke only of suffering and despair, has become the foundation note of a harmony that continues to grow with each passing season. We saved each other that day, but more importantly, we discovered that salvation shared becomes transformation for all who witness it. The legacy of the bear trap would continue long after Hannah Morrison and Tachi had established their place in territorial history, their story becoming part of the larger American narrative about the power of individuals to shape their communities through choices made with courage and compassion. In a territory built on the principle that determined people could create better lives through cooperation, they had proven that such cooperation could become lived reality for anyone brave enough to build bridges instead of walls. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.